The Section 5 inspection regime is well underway, but for those on the front line, there are still a lot of questions. Five determined literacy coordinators from a cross-section of schools have come to Ofsted HQ to get their questions answered. With primary literacy high on the national agenda, this is their opportunity to explore what inspectors are really looking for. Time to turn the tables on Primary Literacy Inspector Paul Wagstaff.
At the end of the day, what we're wanting to see is the impact of whatever the school's doing on the achievement of pupils.
How does a subject survey differ to a Section 5 inspection? So if a school got a phone call to say that you're having a subject survey, you know, then the school would know what to expect. So we kind of know what to expect for a Section 5, which is a small amount of panic.
The Section 5 inspection is a look at the central nervous system of the school, the leadership and the management, the achievement of pupils, and checking that things all run together. The difference between that and a subject or a survey visit is that the focus will be quite narrow.
So if you were coming to our school for a subject survey, with reading and writing being at the heart of that, what exactly would you be looking for?
What we'd be really trying to understand is why things are as they are. Nationally, we have 84% of children currently, by the end of Key Stage 2, are reaching level 4+ in reading. But in writing, we haven't got the same success there. And what a subject survey visit tries to do is to try and understand what the national issues are.
When you come into the school, it's such a limited amount of time.
Yes.
What do you advise us to really strongly prepare?
Most subject survey visits will be one day. Generally, in literacy, it would involve discussions with the head teacher, looking at the school's tracking data, having a discussion with the subject leader, observing a lesson or a couple of lessons, and depending on the focus beyond that, it might be looking at an intervention programme working within the school, talking with pupils, listening to children read. It might be a whole range of things, but that's decided at the point that the inspection survey is taking place.
When you observe, are you then looking at the children and the results of the children in the lesson, or are you looking at the teacher, or are you looking at the objectives of the lesson?
On the Section 5 inspection, at the end of the day, what we're wanting to see is the impact of whatever the school's doing on the achievement of pupils, what children are learning, the progress that they're making, what contribution the teaching has to that. Within a subject survey visit, we may want to narrow our focus on, so for instance, in an English survey, it might be looking particularly at how speaking and listening is being developed. It might be looking at how reading's taking shape and the kind of strategies that the teacher's using.
Is it completely random, or are they selected for a reason? Which schools are you going to have the subject survey for?
It's a random sample that must reflect the national picture, and there's been a commitment from Ofsted that no school will have more than one subject survey visit in between their Section 5 inspections. So it won't be that you have a visit for English this week, next term you have a visit for maths. It will be a Section 5 inspection, then at some stage within you will have a subject. Some schools would, not all primary schools, but some schools would have a subject survey visit and then their next Section 5.
As a school, we've taken a lot more on the creativity side, and we're bringing a lot more speaking, listening, role play, drama, and we've taken strands from the literacy strategy and used set text. Do you feel that perhaps we need to push that more?
I suppose it's raising the bar and looking at the next stage, which is often the most difficult to move forward. Certainly our evidence and research evidence has indicated that speaking, listening, drama, interacting with children in that way, it certainly helps.
I work in a school where the majority of the children have English as an additional language, and I believe that using a range of strategies we can cater for these children. I mean, what are your experiences of this?
It's always an issue that we should never assume that all boys, for instance, learn to write and read in the same way, but similarly we would want to avoid saying that all children who are learning an additional language learn in the same way. And I think you've answered the question in one sense by saying it's a range of strategies. Speaking and listening is a key focus there.
Recently I took part in a visual literacy project where we're looking at a text and also a film version of the text. For children with EAL and for boys with their writing, it proved to be so successful. And just really looking and observing and taking everything in and coming up with brainstorming adjectives and adverbs to describe and acting out whatever the emotion is. So then they're able to put that down in words, you know, in a completely different way to if they're writing cold, write about love.
I would totally agree, and certainly the evidence is indicating that particularly is a good strategy for boys. An important point that you've missed there, which I'm sure is there, and it certainly is coming through, is the issue of the teachers questioning and the skills of asking the right questions, which will then engage and draw children and learning forward.
I'm pleased that now we've had the green light for creativity. That's great.
There's always the conscious thing about evidence, and we need evidence for everything. I know that a lot of my children get scared of making a mistake when it's on a piece of paper. So we try and use whiteboards and things like that. But then, of course, it gets wiped off at the end of the lesson. And I'm left thinking, oh, they've done lots this week, but there's absolutely nothing in their book. As an inspector, do you then look through their books and look at all the evidence? Or is it more in the final result?
I think the evidence isn't just in pieces of completed pieces of work. The evidence is actually in the children's minds. The evidence is there in the teacher's planning. So it needn't be always written down. I think what we would certainly wish to see is that children are clearly making progress. And what I really like to see, some exciting pieces of writing that really show that children are actually applying their various writing skills into ways that are meaningful.
I've noticed in our school that when the writing has more meaning for them than an exercise on, you know, I've done lots of work on these sentences that have got nothing to do with what I'm writing, and you ask them to apply.
Isn't it? An outcome at the end of the week. You have to be able to achieve this by the end of the week. I think that's where the strategy's lacked something. We've been given lots of different strands, but there's not actually an outcome at the end of it.
I think they need to see that you finished it, copy it up neatly, and even if it is just a handwriting exercise for a lesson, I think it's really valuable so the children can then see it neatly on the wall.
Yeah.
They've published it, or they're going to recite it, or they're going to show it. They need to have a finished item at the end of it.
Yeah,
It's
publishing.
the audience, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Children need to know that what they're doing is valued. Certainly the flexibilities within the National Literacy Strategy are really giving that opportunity for teachers to use the structure and the guidance in terms of a progression of objectives, but to think beyond English and the teaching of literacy being within that narrow hour per week.
I know this is back to our very beginning thing, quite well with what I was going to ask you about. How would you, or how do you see good practice as grouping children, whether to have like higher ability groups and lower ability groups, or whether to have completely mixed or different ages? What, from what you've seen, would you say works the best?
Where teaching is good or better, it's often that the teacher is very clearly differentiated or grouped accordingly to make sure that the needs of each different group within that class are being met, and you can stand there and say, yes, all these children are gaining from this lesson. And again, it comes down to the assessment and the teacher's use of assessment to ensure that the objectives are well matched, but equally that the organisation is as such that it's allowing children to learn.
I find the idea of children working in groups and pairs very underrated by some people. People think, you know, oh, if they're not doing it by themselves, they're not going to learn it. And I always say to my class, you know, 2 heads are better than 1, and 6 heads are, you know, you're off. I find that if you can carefully pair children up so the gap isn't too big, then that seems to get the most out of them and working together. Yes. And I really think it's down to the teacher and what you're actually teaching. And unfortunately, you can't just say one size fits all. So the best way is to do, you know, ability or mixed ability. Yeah. And it is hard to kind of be constantly...
It's the teacher's knowledge of what those children can do and what they need at that particular time. We see a range of practices in schools with setting, with ability grouping. And the question that we always ask is, how do you know that that's working?
Our school is over 50% EAL, and we have sort of group rooms, and we want all the LSAs to stay within the class, but we also feel there's a time and a place for the children to be taken away from the class and have their sort of time with a one-on-one teacher. I mean, what are your views if you were going in to inspect the literacy? Would you be happy to see that?
It's fitness for purpose, isn't it? It's always a balancing act of ensuring that then they don't miss key parts of the main lesson, but there are times when children need to be taught specifically in that way. The evidence of Ofsted has shown in the past that sometimes some of our most vulnerable children are spending more time with a teaching assistant away from the class than they are with a teacher. It's then ensuring that the school really keeps that under review and is absolutely certain that it's meeting the needs of the broad range of children. And it might very well be
the reason I was asking because if it is just phonics, then that's something I feel sort of very strongly against. You're going to get all these materials that come out that are going to be targeting just always phonics and always books which will not now be real books. They're going to be books that are just specifically looking at all those things.
Obviously, Ofsted has looked at this, and we've said for some time that children need to be able to decode prints. They need to have a very strong understanding of phonics and the phonemes that will help them move forward so they can begin to make sense of the words on the page. But at some stage, children need to have a broader range of strategies to support their understanding. And it's the early identification of what different children need to learn.
Do you think that by focusing on phonics at the beginning, that we're all going to get too fixed on teaching phonics in the foundation stage? Because English is such a bizarre language that we've got lots of words that don't rely on phonics, but they still go back. If they don't know the word, they still try and sound it out, and they'll still say a word which doesn't make any sense at all. They're not actually thinking about the meaning and thinking, oh, that isn't a word, but we know to sound it out, so that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Lots of new teachers think of teaching reading as we're listening to the children read and sounding out, and that's fine to a certain point, but when you get to Key Stage 2, it's the whole thing of the decoding, actually working out the meaning and what happens if you do come to that word within the sentence. And I think unless your school identifies where each year group roughly, and obviously it will change because some cohorts are different, but having a sort of sequence of where each year group can focus on linked to the framework, and that's where the framework's been very, very useful. And I think it's given teachers an area to focus on for their year group. You know, it is a mixture of strategies, but I do also think it's very important to have a structure for teachers if you're the subject coordinator.
Yes. And our evidence would indicate that where schools are successful in teaching children to read, the teaching of phonics is very strong, very secure. People know the progression through there, and they're very quickly getting children to be able to have those skills to be able to decode words. But what we also find is there is a strong literacy-rich environment that encourages children to use, to love and to enjoy and share books.
I think the key thing in terms of literacy, which goes for reading and writing, are texts. If you give the children a killer text, something that really gets them going, then they are going to produce amazing writing. And if you give them a mediocre text, they're going to give you mediocre writing.
If we're using that reading and writing sequence, which the strategy promotes, the immersion in the text is absolutely crucial. In Birmingham, at my school, we've recently been studying Goodnight Mr. Tom, and we've also set up a radio station, which really the aim was to promote the speaking and listening. And children have worked around the text with a range of activities, organising interviews with characters, empathising with characters, and producing a radio show using the cross-curricular links with the history and the aspects of rationing and the war aspects. And it really did promote the speaking and listening and gave them a purpose for the actual studying of the text.
I think that's a crucial point, that it's this richness of literature that can provide children with a very good model. It links with the speaking and the listening, and I particularly liked the issue raised about cross-curricular work.
So I think it's also about encouraging children to have their own opinion and how what they think of a text isn't going to be the same as what the person next to them thinks of a text. So you need to be careful that they aren't giving you the answer that we want and saying we think it's good just because their teacher thinks it's good, but it's what they actually think and get from it.
One of the things Ofsted has found in recent times is where literacy goes beyond the literacy hour and moves into other subjects, then it gives a richness and a genuine reason and a purpose for children to want to know and to want to actually write and to read, to find out. And it's a combination of all these factors that can really inspire and make learning genuine and purposeful.